There are plenty of modern lists of the greatest Hollywood movie stars of all time. Some of these lists are based on box office sales and some are based on pure subjective opinion. But is there a more definitive way to find the actual biggest stars of each year? Well, obviously there is, or I wouldn't be making a video about it. Up next, we look at Quigley's Top 10 Money-Making Stars poll and see what it has to tell us. The Top 10 Money-Making Stars polls were conducted from 1915 to 2013 based on a standardised format set by the Quigley Publishing Company. The key difference between this and other polls is that Quigley's polls were sent to movie exhibitors, i.e. the people running the movie theatres. The benefit of using this dataset over the more common one of box office gross is that it removes the issue of attributing gross revenue to an actor on the basis of the amount that a movie made. With the gross revenue metric, for example, if a movie had as its leads an established star and a newcomer, the draw of the established star would have arguably been responsible for the majority of the box office, whereas both of the leads would be credited with the gross revenue equally. So who better to tell us who the biggest stars actually were than the people whose livelihoods depended on the public buying movie tickets? I've taken all of the top 10 polls from 1915 to 2013 and assigned points based on each star's position in each year. 10 points for number 1, down to 1 point for number 10. So as we can get a feel for which stars were biggest through the ages, I'm going to go through decade by decade, from the 1910s to the 2010s. As this represents a lot of history to get through, I'm going to split this into 4 parts. So let's start with a look at how the movie star came to be. The first American movie star was Canadian actress Florence Lawrence. In 1908 alone, she appeared in 44 movies, leading the public to begin to recognise her and inquire as to her name. At this time, the cast of movies were not credited by name, as there was still stigma around actors appearing in movies, as opposed to serious, respectable theatre. Also, studio bosses thought it would lead to them demanding higher wages. Due to these factors, possibly more due to the latter, her studio, Biograph, referred to her solely as the Biograph Girl. This continued until she moved to the independent moving pictures company, lured by its founder and co-founder of Universal Pictures, Carl Laemmle. In order to publicise the move, Laemmle started a rumour that Lawrence had been killed by a streetcar in New York City. Then, once the story had gained enough media exposure, ran an ad in the industry newspapers correcting the lie that was being circulated and pointing out that Lawrence would be starring in 2 upcoming movies for his studio. This, along with a public appearance arranged by Laemmle to dispel the hoax at which she was mobbed by fans, caused Florence Lawrence to become a household name. However, by 1915 her star had waned. So, if you were sat on the couch in the late 19-teens, wondering what to go and see at the Picture Palace that evening, who would be the big stars that would catch your eye? Here we can see the top 10 stars from the beginning of the Quigley poll in 1915 to the end of the decade. Florence Lawrence's fellow Canadian, Mary Pickford, occupies the top spot jointly with William S. Hart. William Surrey Hart was one of the first great movie western stars. However, he started out in 1888 as a stage actor, becoming quite renowned and going on to perform Shakespeare and to direct opera. A great devotee of the Old West period and friend of famed lawmen Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson, his westerns were noted for their dedication to realism, upon which Hart insisted. Hart's style of westerns was supplanted in the 1920s by more upbeat, flashy, action-orientated movies, and Hart retired to his ranch in 1925. Mary Pickford was, alongside Florence Lawrence, one of the first actresses to receive a name credit for her films. She was one of the top stars of the 1910s and 20s, generally playing ingenues, sweet, innocent young women. However, off-screen she was anything but innocent. She negotiated herself the first $1 million contract for an actress in 1916, a deal which also gave her full authority over the films in which she starred. Pickford was also a co-founder of both the Studio United Artists and the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, alongside our number 3 on this list, her second husband, Douglas Fairbanks. Fairbanks was best known during this time for his leading roles in romantic comedies. Arriving in Hollywood in 1915, by 1918 he had become its third highest paid star. Though he would carry on an affair with Pickford until her divorce from her first husband, and the two would appear together publicly, they did not actually get married until 1920. Wallace Reid was a major matinee idol. Hitting the top spot in the poll in 1919 and actually remaining there in 1920, he was referred to by Motion Picture magazine in 1919 as the screen's most perfect lover. He married actress Dorothy Davenport in 1913, but died of complications from morphine addiction in 1923. Dorothy Davenport went on to produce social consciousness films, beginning with Human Wreckage in 1923, a film to raise awareness of drug addiction. Anita Stewart, one of the earliest actresses to attain fame, was billed early on in her career as America's daintiest actress. She was under contract to Vitagraph until 1917, when she left to form Anita Stewart Productions with a New England-based movie exhibitor called Louis B. Mayer. Though her company was both commercially and critically successful, she grew tired of Mayer's moralistic approach. Because of this, she left the company, but she did subsequently appear in several more movies for other producers. J. Warren Kerrigan was a star on the rise until, in 1917, he made an ill-judged comment to a journalist stating his opinion that men who are only good for lower grades of work should be sent to war before actors. As the First World War was in progress at this point in time, his comments were not well received by the general public. Tom Mix was one of the new wave of upbeat Western stars that began to supplant the likes of William S. Hart in the latter part of the decade. We shall hear more of him in the 1920s. Charles Ray had a great success in playing good-natured country bumpkin-type characters in light comedies in the 1910s. However, his production, through his own company, of The Courtship of Miles Standish, a movie based on an 1858 narrative poem, became an obsession. It flopped commercially, as many of his friends had predicted, because it was, a movie based on a narrative poem, and bankrupted him. William Farnham was a Broadway star, playing the lead in Ben-Hur from 1900 to 1905, before becoming a major movie star in early silent movies, continuing to act in lesser roles until his last movie in 1952. Mary Miles Minter was a Mary Pickford-alike who was well on the way to rivaling Pickford in ingenue roles when a failed romance with director William Desmond Taylor led to his death at the hands of her mother. Her career was ruined by this, and she left movies in 1923. And so to the decade that saw the beginning of the Jazz Age, Prohibition, and Hollywood becoming the United States' fifth biggest industry, and the world's preeminent producer of motion pictures. And we see a familiar face at the top of the list. Douglas Fairbanks continued his ascent during the decade with his creation of the historical swashbuckling movie. These were big-budget movies such as Robin Hood and The Mark of Zorro, which took advantage of his charisma and athleticism and were hugely popular with audiences. The 20s was the decade in which he and Mary Pickford became known as the King and Queen of Hollywood, and so it's no surprise to see Pickford at number 2 on the list. During the 20s she continued to produce and star in her own movies to great success, but her career began to fade with the introduction of talkies in the late 20s. Now in her late 30s, Pickford was too old to play the ingenue role, and she was not embraced by the public in more sophisticated roles, though she did continue to produce films for United Artists. Norma Talmadge ranked in or around the top 10 stars from 1920 to 1926, including topping the poll in 1924. She mostly acted in melodramas and was regarded as one of the most glamorous movie actresses of the decade. In 1917, Talmadge and her husband, Joseph M. Schenck, set up the Norma Talmadge Film Corporation in, unusually for the time, New York City. The studio was successful, attracting talent such as Buster Keaton and Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, as well as producing Talmadge's own movies, the most successful of which was Smiling Through in 1922. One useful side effect of being in New York City was access to the country's leading fashion designers, who were happy to aid with her glamorous image. Another glamour icon of the decade, this time the mid to late 20s, was Colleen Moore. She was the number 1 star in the 1926 poll and was one of the principal popularisers of the bob haircut. Moore's fame waned with the coming of talkies, but due to her savvy investing, including becoming a partner in what was to become the wealth management firm Merrill Lynch, She lived comfortably for the rest of her life. On the other end of the glamour spectrum we find Lon Chaney, the man of 1,000 faces. He was renowned for his ability in humanising downtrodden, grotesque characters, such as here in The Phantom of the Opera. The revolutionary makeup techniques used in these characterisations were developed and implemented by Chaney himself. Next, a three-way tie. Clara Bow topped both the 1928 and 1929 Quigley polls. She was one of the defining stars of the era, known for her sassy, magnetic screen presence, with producer David O. Selznick explaining that he would expect to make 3 times the box office from a movie by the simple expedient of replacing the lead actress with Clara Bow. It was during the 1920s that Tom Mix reached the height of his fame, being the #1 star on the 1927 poll. Mix and his horse, Tony the Wonder Horse, made more than 160 westerns and in the process defined many of what would become the tropes of the genre. Topping the Quigley poll in 1925, the Italian actor Rudolph Valentino was the male sex symbol of the early to mid-20s. This was until his untimely death at the age of 31 in 1926, whereupon an estimated 100,000 fans lined the streets of Manhattan for his funeral. Next, tied for 9th, are Marion Davies and Harold Lloyd. Davis was a featured performer in the Ziegfeld Follies when she met media tycoon William Randolph Hearst, subsequently becoming his mistress. Hearst promoted her in his media outlets and produced her films to great success, though her career declined with the coming of sound. Harold Lloyd was present in the top 10 from 1922 to 1928 and was the most commercially successful of the silent era physical comedians, his films grossing more than Charlie Chaplin's and a lot more than Buster Keaton's. A mention here also for Thomas Meighan, who just missed the overall top 10 but was the top actor in the poll in 1923, and also appeared in the top 10s from 1922 to 1926. He was a leading man in several major movies, but decided to move into real estate with the coming of sound. This was due to his turning 50 years old and fearing that, as a result, his popularity would decline. And so we fully enter the talking picture era of Hollywood. The 30s represent a line in the sand, as many huge stars of the 20s did not make successful transitions to the sound era, with a raft of new stars replacing them. The 30s also saw the introduction of the Hays Production Code, meaning less sex and violence and more moralising from the middle of the decade onwards. Top of the poll for the 30s is Clark Gable, the decade's definitive leading man. Gable's first starring role came at the request of his co-star, Joan Crawford, in the 1931 picture Dance Fools Dance. His studio, MGM, continued to pair him, to great success, with top female stars, including Crawford on 8 more occasions and Jean Harlow on 6. Gable starred alongside Claudette Colbert in the 1934 screwball comedy It Happened One Night, which was the first movie to win all 5 major Academy Awards. To finish off the decade, in 1939, Gable was the male lead in the highest-grossing movie of all time, Gone with the Wind. Our number 2 star was appropriately 2 years old at the start of the 1930s. Shirley Temple was the top star on the Quigley poll from 1935 to 1938. Her movies, which bear in mind came out during the Depression era, were themed around her innocent yet precocious character and were comedic dramas focusing on overcoming bad situations. They also included a lot of dancing. Her favourite co-star was apparently Bill Bojangles Robinson, with whom she performed the stair dance in 1935's The Little Colonel. Temple's acting career ended with adolescence, but she went on to appear on television and also had a significant career in politics, serving as United States ambassador to both Ghana and Czechoslovakia. And in third place, a tie. Joan Crawford topped the poll in 1930 and continued to appear in the top 10 until 1936. Her image was that of the free-spirited flapper in the late 1920s, but her studio, MGM, transitioned her to more sophisticated roles in the 1930s, often alongside Clark Gable, as previously mentioned. Many of these films were significant commercial successes and, though her star status decreased somewhat, she continued to star in successful movies until 1970. One of her final acting jobs was in the TV movie Night Gallery in 1969, directed by Steven Spielberg. Her daughter Christina's memoir about Crawford's abusive parenting style was made into the 1981 movie Mommy Dearest. The first winner of the Best Actress Oscar in 1929, Janet Gaynor was one of the few stars to transition from silent to sound movies. Her image was similar to Mary Pickford's in the decade before, playing sweet, innocent, wholesome roles. But as the 30s wore on and audience tastes changed, she fell from star status, losing out at her studio Fox to Shirley Temple, among others. This was until David O. Selznick offered her the lead role in 1937's A Star is Born, for which she earned a second Best Actress Oscar nomination and which placed her back on top of the industry. However, having been making movies for 17 years, she decided to retire a year later, aged 33. Prior to the arrival of the talkies, Will Rogers, a very popular humorist, newspaper columnist and vaudevillian, had a minor career in motion pictures. However, with the arrival of sound, he was finally able to bring his verbal wit to movie audiences to great success, topping the Quigley poll in 1934. Unfortunately, his career was cut short when he was killed in a plane crash in 1935. 1931's Best Actress Academy Award winner for Min and Bill, Marie Dressler, was top of the Quigley poll in 1932 and 1933. She occupied the opposite end of the age scale to Shirley Temple, being 61 years old at the beginning of the 1930s. She had appeared in films and on stage in the 1910s, but her career had declined during the 1920s. It was her ability in speaking roles that helped her return to the movies in the 1930s, where she starred in both comedies and dramas to huge success. Unfortunately, Dressler was diagnosed with terminal cancer and died in July 1934. Mostly a character actor throughout the 1920s, Wallace Beery had ascended to leading man status by 1930. But the picture that rocketed him to star status was 1930's Min and Bill alongside Marie Dressler. He remained in the top 10 until 1935, at which point his status began to decrease, moving eventually to supporting roles. Robert Taylor was a major leading man in the late 30s, appearing in movies across a variety of genres. He was an Anglophile and argued strongly for the United States' entry into the Second World War. After the war, he continued to work in lead roles, but never again attained the prominence he enjoyed in the late 1930s. The first team on the list is Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. They made 9 films in the 1930s for RKO, all of which were successes. However, the high production costs took their toll on the studio, and the pair did not make another film together for 10 years after 1939's The Story of Vernon and Irene Castle. Described by Laurence Olivier as the best there has ever been, Mickey Rooney had a movie career spanning 9 decades. Rooney made his film debut in 1927 at the age of 7 and worked steadily until achieving great success, ascending to number 1 on the poll in 1939, playing the lead in the Andy Hardy films, beginning in 1937. We will be seeing more of Mickey Rooney in the 1940s. So that brings us to the end of Part 1, with the United States standing on the brink of entry into World War II, but with its economy fully recovered from the Great Depression, and its movie industry dominating the world. Stay tuned to find out what happened to the Hollywood stars during the war and beyond.